Were you ever told to sit still, to speak only when spoken to know your place? Imagine if defying those unspoken rules, or even breaking them entirely, could lead to unimaginable consequences. In the year 1240, for a woman, stepping outside the lines of expected behavior wasn't just frowned upon. It could lead to punishments so harsh they would send shivers down your spine. What would happen if a woman dared to speak her mind too freely, to choose her own path, or to challenge the very foundations of her world? Number 8. The ducking stool and the public cold plunge. Imagine the bustling market square of a small English town in the spring of 1240. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, and the earthy tang of the cobbled streets. Chickens peck at scraps, merchants loudly hawk their wares, and children chase stray dogs. Today, the usual rhythm is broken by a different kind of spectacle. Crowd gathers not around a juggler or a traveling storyteller, but around a simple, yet terrifying, contraption, a wooden chair affixed to a long beam, balanced precariously over the sluggish, green water of the town's pond. This is the ducking stool, and its purpose is grim. Elara, a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her gentle demeanor, stands before the gathering. Her hands are bound, and a rough rope chafes at her wrists. Eyes dart nervously, catching glimpses of the faces in the crowd, some curious, some stern, some openly gleeful. Elara's crime. She is accused of being a common scold, a woman whose incessant nagging, gossip, and public brawling has disrupted the peace of the community one too many times. Her voice, once a tool for sharp wit and lively conversation, had become a weapon, tearing at the reputation of neighbors, stirring discord between families, and even challenging the authority of the local reeve, the chief magistrate of the town. The village elder, a stern-faced man with a flowing white beard, reads aloud from a parchment scroll. His words, delivered in a monotone, recount Elara's numerous transgressions, how she had accused the baker's wife of watering down her ale, how she had spread rumors about the young miller's flirtations, and how she had even dared to publicly question the fairness of the tithes collected by the church. Her disobedience was not against a single person, but against the very notion of feminine decorum and communal harmony. In a world where order and reputation were paramount, a woman who sowed discord with her words was seen as a dangerous force. Two burly men, the town constables, grasped the ends of the ducking stool's beam. Creak of old wood, Elara is forced into the chair, her skirts billowing around her. A strap is fastened across her chest, securing her tightly. The crowd holds its breath. Elara lets out a desperate cry, but it is swallowed by the growing murmur of the onlookers. Constables begin to lower the beam, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Splash! The cold, murky water engulfs Elara. She gasps, a strangled sound as the icy shock hits her. Her hair, usually neatly braided, streams around her face, plastered to her skin. The crowd lets out a collective gasp, some recoiling, others leaning forward for a better view. The men lift her, dripping and shivering for a moment, allowing her to take a ragged breath before plunging her back down again. Once, twice, 3 times, the ritual is repeated, each dunking designed not just to humiliate, but to literally cool her temper, to wash away her verbal offenses, and to force a chilling silence upon her. The experience is excruciating. Cold pierces her to the bone, her lungs burn, and the feeling of helplessness is overwhelming. When she is finally pulled out for the last time, she is drenched, shivering uncontrollably, and utterly silent. Her defiance has been broken, not by force of argument, but by the relentless chill of the water and the crushing weight of public humiliation. She is a spectacle, a warning to every woman present that the power of their tongue, if misused, would be met with swift and public retribution. Ducking stool, or even just a crude method of plunging a woman into a pond or river, was a common resort in medieval communities for dealing with women whose speech was deemed unruly, disobedient, or disruptive to the patriarchal order of the time. It was a clear demonstration that a woman's voice was not entirely her own, and that society reserved the right to silence it through discomfort and disgrace. Elara, humbled and soaked, would forever carry the memory of that cold plunge, a stark reminder of the cost of speaking too freely in 1240. Her voice, once loud and unyielding, was now a whisper, and her defiance had been literally drowned. Number 7. The pillory and stocks for public shame. Imagine the central square of a bustling medieval town, not just for trade and festivals, but also for justice. In the year 1240, justice was often served in the open, a spectacle for all to witness, and a grim lesson for those who might consider straying from the path. This open-air courtroom and prison often featured two simple, yet effective, devices of public humiliation: the pillory and the stocks. While both were used for various petty crimes, they were particularly effective in punishing acts of disobedience or social transgression, especially when it came to women. Consider the plight of Agnes. She wasn't a criminal in the modern sense, but her actions had undeniably disrupted the fragile order of her small community. Agnes was a skilled weaver, her hands nimble, her designs intricate. Yet her meticulous nature, and perhaps a touch of pride, had led her astray. She had been caught repeatedly short-changing customers, claiming her finished cloths were longer or wider than they actually were, or mixing inferior wool with finer threads. Her disobedience wasn't a direct challenge to authority, but a subversion of the communal trust that underpinned all trade. Actions were seen as a betrayal of fair dealing, a breach of her word, and a defiance of the honest labor expected of all artisans. In a society where economic exchange was often based on reputation and trust, Agnes's deceit was a grave offense, undermining the very livelihood of others and displaying a disregard for the community's welfare. The morning of her punishment dawned clear and cold. Agnes, her face pale and drawn, was led by the town guard to the pillory. This was a heavy wooden frame, fixed upright, with hinged boards that closed around the neck and wrists. Her hands were secured, her head thrust through the central opening, forcing her to stand, hunched and uncomfortable, unable to cover her face. Her arms were stretched wide, locked in place, a living cross of shame. Pain in her shoulders began almost immediately, a dull ache that would grow into a searing torment over the hours. Feet were then secured in the stocks, a similar device but positioned lower to the ground, designed to lock the ankle. Sometimes the pillory and stocks were combined, but often they were separate, depending on the nature of the crime and the degree of humiliation intended. Agnes, the combination ensured she was utterly immobile, unable to escape the gaze of the crowd. Town crier, a man with a booming voice, read out her transgressions, detailing how she had cheated the widow Maeve out of 2 yards of fine linen, and how she had sold short wool to the local monastery. Each accusation was met with murmurs from the crowd, some of them sympathetic but most filled with righteous indignation. Children, unaware of the gravity, pointed and giggled. Adults, however, understood the lesson being taught. As the morning wore on, the discomfort for Agnes became unbearable. The sun, initially a welcome warmth, now beat down on her head, causing her to sweat. Flies buzzed around her face, landing on her eyes and mouth, but her bound hands prevented her from swatting them away. Then came the missiles. Not stones or anything truly dangerous, for that was usually forbidden unless the crowd was extremely incensed, but rotten vegetables, clumps of mud, and sometimes even animal dung. Each hit was a physical manifestation of the community's disapproval, a direct assault on her dignity. A half-eaten apple splattered against her cheek, leaving a sticky residue. A handful of mud clung to her hair. Each humiliating assault chipped away at her pride, forcing her to confront the public's judgment. The experience was not just physically grueling, but profoundly psychologically damaging. To be held immobile, vulnerable, and exposed to the jeers and contempt of her neighbors, many of whom she had known her entire life, was a crushing burden. There was no escape, no hiding place, no shred of privacy. Every sneer, every whispered insult, every splat of a rotten turnip was a mark against her character, a permanent stain on her reputation. When she was finally released at sunset, her limbs stiff and aching, her body covered in grime, and her spirit utterly broken, Agnes was not just physically exhausted. She was an outcast. Her disobedience, born of greed and a disregard for fair play, had been punished not just by discomfort, but by a public stripping away of her standing. Pillory and stocks served as a stark reminder in 1240 that defying the unspoken rules of honesty and community trust, especially for a woman who was expected to uphold moral standards within the domestic and economic sphere, would be met with an unforgiving and unforgettable public reckoning. Agnes learned that day that the weight of community disapproval could be heavier than any chains, and that her defiance had cost her everything. Number 6. Forced public penance and excommunication by the Church. In 1240, the Church was not merely a place of worship, it was the bedrock of society, the ultimate moral authority, and often the law itself. Influence permeated every aspect of life, from the crowning of kings to the daily routines of peasants. To defy the church or to commit a sin deemed gravely offensive to God and the community was to invite a punishment that transcended the physical realm, striking directly at a woman's soul and her very place in the world. For women, whose moral purity was often seen as essential to the spiritual health of the entire community, religious disobedience carried a particularly heavy weight. Meet Isabella. She was a woman of spirit and a fierce independence, but her most grievous transgression was a defiance not against a temporal lord, but against the holy institution itself. Isabella had been found guilty of adultery. While her husband, a stern but well-respected merchant, was away on a long trading journey, Isabella had succumbed to temptation with a dashing young squire. Her disobedience was not only to her marital vows, but to the sacrament of marriage, a holy bond blessed by God and overseen by the church. Adultery, especially by a married woman, was considered a heinous sin, a moral pollution that threatened the very fabric of society and the sanctity of family lines. It was a breach of divine law, a challenge to the moral order, and a betrayal of the deepest trust. Punishment was not a beating or a device, but a spiritual and social annihilation administered by the local bishop. Isabella was sentenced to public penance, a ritual designed to humble her utterly and to serve as a stark warning to others. The process began with the pronouncement of her excommunication, a terrifying judgment that severed her from the communion of believers, from the grace of God, and effectively from her community. She was forbidden from receiving sacraments, no baptism for her children, no communion for herself, no last rites upon her death. In the eyes of God, and therefore in the eyes of her peers, she was an outcast, her soul condemned. On the day of her public penance, Isabella was led to the packed village church. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the hushed whispers of the congregation. The sunlight, usually warm and welcoming through the stained glass windows, seemed to shun her. She was stripped of her fine clothes and dressed in a rough, plain sackcloth, a symbol of humility and repentance. Her head was bowed, and a candle, heavy and hot, was placed in her trembling hand. The priest, his voice booming through the nave, recounted Isabella's sins in stark, unforgiving terms. He spoke of the breaking of vows, the defilement of the marital bed, and the offense to God. Isabella was made to kneel at the very front of the church, before the altar, facing the entire congregation. She remained there for the entirety of the long, solemn mass, her knees aching, her back stiff, the heavy candle melting slowly in her grip, dripping wax onto her skin. She was forbidden to look up, to meet the eyes of anyone in the crowd, including her children, who had been brought to witness their mother's shame. But the penance did not end with the Mass. For several consecutive Sundays, Isabella was forced to stand outside the church door, before services, holding the same burning candle, exposed to the elements and the unwavering gaze of those entering. She was expected to wear the sackcloth whenever she left her home. Her once respected name was now a whisper of shame, a cautionary tale. Merchants avoided her, women averted their eyes, and even the village children pointed at her, having learned from their parents the gravity of her crime. Excommunication was a social death sentence. No one could truly speak to her, do business with her, or even offer her comfort without risking their own standing with the church. Her husband, though not directly punished, was deeply shamed by her actions, and while their marriage might not have been formally dissolved, their relationship was irrevocably broken. Her dower, the property settled upon her for her sustenance should her husband die, was almost certainly forfeit, leaving her dependent on his mercy or utterly destitute. Isabella's life was shattered. Her act of disobedience, a yearning for illicit affection, had not just led to public disgrace, but to a spiritual banishment that echoed into eternity. 1240, for a woman to be cut off from the church was to be cut off from life itself, a chilling testament to the power of religious authority to control and punish female disobedience, especially when it challenged the sacred bonds woven into the very structure of medieval society. Penance, both public and internal, would be a lifelong burden, a stark reminder of the ultimate consequences of defying the spiritual and moral laws that governed every breath. Number 5. Loss of dower, dowry, and property rights. In the year 1240, a woman's legal and financial standing was inextricably tied to the men in her life, her father, her husband, or her male guardians. While a woman of means might possess rights to her own property before marriage, upon matrimony, much of her wealth often became her husband's, managed by him, and her economic security for widowhood came from her dower, a portion of her husband's lands or property set aside for her use after his death. Her dowry, brought from her family to the marriage, was often absorbed into the husband's estate, though it might theoretically be returned if the marriage was annulled or if she was widowed. Disobedience, particularly grave forms such as adultery or desertion, could lead to a catastrophic economic punishment, the complete loss of these crucial rights, stripping a woman of her means of survival and her very status. Consider the fate of Lady Seraphina. She was not a peasant, but a woman of noble birth, married to a powerful lord. Their union had been arranged, a strategic alliance between two prominent families, and Seraphina had dutifully brought a substantial dowry of lands and silver into the marriage. For years, she had performed her duties as a lady of the manor, managing the household, overseeing the servants, and bearing her husband a son and heir. However, beneath the veneer of obedience, Seraphina harbored a secret passion for a charming knight who frequented her husband's court. Her disobedience was a profound betrayal of her marriage vows, her husband, and the intricate web of feudal obligations that defined her life. It was a scandal that threatened the purity of the noble lineage and the stability of the entire noble house. When the affair was discovered, not by rumor, but by irrefutable evidence presented to her furious husband, the consequences were swift and devastating. Her husband, a man of considerable power and influence, did not resort to physical violence, which was common in other cases. Instead, he invoked the full force of the law and custom to punish her in a way that struck at the very core of her existence as a woman of her standing. His wrath was a calculated dismantling of her economic future. First, her dower was forfeited. This meant that the lands and incomes that were promised to her for her sustenance, should she become a widow, were now legally stripped away. If her husband were to die, she would be left with absolutely nothing, no means to support herself, no home to call her own. In medieval society, where women rarely held independent wealth or had access to professions outside the home, the dower was often a woman's only safeguard against destitution in widowhood. Its loss meant utter poverty. Next, her dowry was not returned. While theoretically the dowry might revert to her family upon certain circumstances, in cases of adultery or desertion, it was often legally considered lost to the husband's estate. Seraphina's once considerable wealth, brought from her own family, was now permanently absorbed into her husband's control, with no hope of recovery. Her family, shamed by her actions, was unlikely to take her back or support her, especially given the scandal. Suddenly, Lady Seraphina, once a woman of status and means, found herself utterly dispossessed. She was effectively disinherited, not just from her husband's wealth, but from her own family's financial security. She was cast out of the manor, stripped of her fine clothes, left with only the rough attire suitable for a commoner. She had no home, no income, and no protection. The wealth she had known her entire life vanished, replaced by the stark reality of medieval poverty. Fall from grace was a public spectacle, a chilling demonstration of the consequences of female disobedience within the highest echelons of society. For a noblewoman, the loss of property and financial independence was perhaps an even more brutal punishment than physical harm. It meant the loss of status, security, and any hope of a dignified future. Seraphina, who had defied the sacred bonds of marriage for love, found herself with nothing. She was forced to rely on the charity of distant relatives, or more likely, to live a life of profound hardship. Her gentle hands, once accustomed to silk and embroidery, now rough with manual labor. Her disobedience, once a whisper of illicit passion, had roared into a devastating financial ruin, leaving her utterly vulnerable in a world that offered little mercy to dispossessed women. This severe economic retribution served as a powerful deterrent, upholding the rigid social and marital structures of 1240. Number 4. Whipping and flogging for theft and immorality. In the year 1240, physical punishment was a common and brutal tool of justice, often administered in public to maximize its deterrent effect. While torture and mutilation were usually reserved for the most heinous crimes, whipping and flogging were frequent punishments for a range of lesser offenses, from petty theft to vagrancy, and crucially, for women, various forms of immorality or repeated minor acts of disobedience. These were acts that, while not necessarily capital crimes, were deemed to undermine the social order and moral expectations, especially for women who were expected to embody virtue and modesty. Consider the story of Mariana, a young woman from a small village struggling to survive. Mariana was not inherently malicious, but desperation had driven her to acts of petty theft. The harvest had been poor, her family was starving, and her aged mother was ill. Driven by an intense desire to provide for her loved ones, she had repeatedly stolen loaves of bread from the baker's stall, and once, a small amount of cheese from the market. Her disobedience was a defiance of property rights, a desperate attempt to circumvent the harsh economic realities that chained many to poverty. While sympathy might be found in her motives, the law of 1240 was unyielding. Theft, especially repeated theft, was a direct challenge to the established order and the sanctity of private property. Her captures were inevitable. One morning, as she attempted to snatch a small sack of flour, the baker, a burly man with flour-dusted arms, caught her. She was brought before the local Lord's Reeve, the legal administrator, who swiftly passed judgment. Punishment was to be a public flogging, a demonstration of the consequences of her defiance. The whipping post stood in the center of the village, a crude wooden pillar firmly embedded in the ground. Mariana was led to it, her heart pounding against her ribs. Arms were stretched above her head, bound tightly to the post, forcing her to stand on the tips of her toes, her back exposed. Air grew thick with anticipation as the villagers gathered, their faces a mixture of solemnity and morbid curiosity. The executioner, a gruff, imposing man, stepped forward, holding a thick leather whip. It was not a cat o' nine tails, but a sturdy single-thonged whip, its tip hardened by years of use. Each stroke was intended to inflict pain, to mark the body as a canvas of punishment. The Reeve read out Mariana's offenses, detailing each stolen item, each act of defiance against the law of property. The first lash cut through the air with a sickening whistle before it landed on Mariana's bare back. A sharp, searing pain exploded across her skin, and she gasped, her body tensing violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, biting back a scream. The sound of the whip, followed by her pained grunt, echoed in the sudden silence of the crowd. Then came another and another, each stroke tearing at her skin, leaving angry red welts that quickly bruised and began to blood. The rhythm of the blows was relentless, mechanical, each one a stark reminder of her transgression. Mariana's muscles screamed in protest, her legs trembled, threatening to give way. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat and the growing redness on her back. Pain was excruciating, not just the physical agony of the whip, but the profound humiliation of being so utterly exposed and vulnerable before her entire community. She could feel the stares, hear the murmurs, and sense the judgment of her neighbors, the very people she had tried to protect through her desperate actions. When the prescribed number of lashes was finally delivered, Mariana was released from the post, her body slumped and trembling. Her back was a raw, bloody mess, the skin torn and inflamed. She was barely able to stand, her legs buckling beneath her. She was a marked woman, not just by the physical scars that would remain, but by the indelible shame of the public spectacle. The effects of the flogging were not just physical. Mariana's ability to work was severely hampered for weeks, the pain making any movement agonizing. More deeply, her reputation was ruined. She was known as a thief, a disobedient member of the community who had defied the law. While some might pity her circumstances, the social stigma would follow her, making it harder to find work, to be trusted, or to rebuild her life. Public whipping served as a chilling warning in 1240 that any woman who dared to defy the established laws of property or to engage in morally questionable behaviors would face not just physical pain, but a lasting mark of societal condemnation, stripping her of her dignity and her place within the community. Her back carried the raw, physical proof of her defiance and the heavy hand of medieval justice. Number 3, hair shaving and ostracization for adultery. In 1240, a woman's hair was often seen as a symbol of her beauty, her modesty, and her social status. For married women, long, braided hair, often covered by a coif or veil, signified her virtue and her adherence to societal norms. Publicly shame a woman by forcibly cutting or shaving her hair was a profound act of degradation, designed to strip her of her dignity, destroy her reputation, and mark her as an outcast. This punishment was often reserved for acts of serious moral disobedience, most notably adultery, especially if it was particularly scandalous or repeated. The act of hair cutting was a symbolic uncrowning of a woman's virtue and her social standing. Consider the case of Lady Elara, a woman whose beauty and grace were once the envy of her village. Married to a respected landowner, Elara was expected to maintain a life of unquestionable virtue and domestic harmony. Yet beneath the surface of her dutiful existence, a dangerous desire simmered. She began a clandestine affair with a traveling minstrel, a charismatic man whose songs and stories captivated her imagination, offering an escape from the mundane routines of her arranged marriage. Her disobedience was not just a personal betrayal, but a profound challenge to the patriarchal order, a defiance of marital fidelity and the strict moral code imposed upon women, particularly those of her standing. The affair was discovered by a suspicious servant, and the news quickly spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. The landowner, publicly humiliated and enraged, sought not only to punish his wife, but to make an example of her. He convened a local assembly, drawing on the deeply ingrained customs of shaming and public censure. Punishment for Elara was decided. She would be publicly shamed, her beautiful hair cut short, and she would be ostracized from the community, effectively sentenced to a social death. The day of the shaming was a grim spectacle. Elara, her face pale and etched with despair, was led to the village square, where a crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of judgment and morbid curiosity. Two grim-faced women, appointed by the local lord, stood before her. One held a pair of large, rough shears. Elara's long, dark hair, usually meticulously braided and pinned, was unbound, cascading down her back. With grim efficiency, the shears were brought to her head. First snip was a loud, horrifying sound, a direct assault on her person. Her hair, once her crowning glory, fell in clumps to the dusty ground, each fallen strand a symbol of her lost virtue and shattered reputation. The women worked quickly, roughly cutting her hair close to her scalp, leaving an uneven, ragged mess. Some accounts even suggest complete shaving, leaving the scalp utterly bare, an even more extreme form of disfigurement and humiliation. As her hair fell, Elara felt a wave of profound despair wash over her. With each snip, she felt a part of herself, her identity, being irrevocably stripped away. She was no longer the beautiful, respected lady, but a shorn, disgraced woman, her head a stark canvas of her transgression. Cold air on her exposed scalp was a constant, chilling reminder of her public fall from grace, but the physical humiliation was only the beginning. Once her hair was cut, she was dressed in a simple, coarse garment, often marked with a distinct symbol or color that immediately identified her as an adulteress. She was then paraded through the village, forced to walk slowly through the jeering and whispering crowd. Children, emboldened by their elders, pointed and shouted insults. Women recoiled from her gaze, and men openly scorned her. The ostracization that followed was even more devastating. Elara was forbidden from attending church services, from participating in community gatherings, and from engaging in any social interaction. No one would speak to her, do business with her, or offer her comfort. She was essentially a ghost, walking among the living but unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. Her husband, who could legally do little else without suffering his own public embarrassment, simply allowed her to exist within the manor as a silent, invisible presence, or even sent her to a remote, isolated property, leaving her to wither in solitude. She was no longer part of the community, her very existence a constant reminder of her disobedience. For a woman in 1240, social standing was everything. To be stripped of her hair, marked by shame, and cast out from the community was a punishment that, while not always fatal, effectively ended her life as she knew it. It was a living death, a constant reminder that any deviation from the strict moral code, any act of profound disobedience, would be met with an unyielding and merciless form of social annihilation. Elara learned that day that the cost of her defiance was not just pain, but an utter erasure of her former self, a permanent mark of shame that would forever define her. Number 2, banishment from the community. In the medieval world of 1240, life was communal. Villages and towns were tight-knit entities, providing protection, sustenance, and identity. To be cast out, to be banished from one's community, was a severe punishment, often tantamount to a death sentence. It stripped a woman of her home, her livelihood, her social connections, and her very means of survival in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. While often reserved for repeat offenders or those whose presence posed a persistent threat to order, banishment was a particularly harsh consequence for women whose disobedience undermined the stability and cohesion of the community. Consider the story of Elara. She was a widow, a woman who had once been respected within her small farming village. However, after her husband's death, a desperate need for resources had led her down a path of increasing defiance. Elara was accused not of a single grand crime, but of a series of persistent, disruptive acts. she was caught poaching rabbits from the Lord's woods, repeatedly stealing small amounts of grain from the communal storehouse, and engaging in frequent, loud disputes with her neighbors over land boundaries and shared resources. Her disobedience was a refusal to adhere to the communal rules of property and peaceful coexistence, a persistent challenge to the authority of the village elders and the Lord's reed. Her actions were seen as a constant source of friction, a disruption to the fragile peace and order of the community. After numerous warnings and smaller punishments that had failed to deter her, the village council, with the blessing of the local lord, decided upon the ultimate measure for a disobedient and disruptive woman: banishment. The decree was read aloud in the village square, a stark pronouncement that severed Lyra's ties to everything she had ever known. The day of her departure was a somber one. Lyra was given only what she could carry: a small, worn cloak, a single loaf of bread, and a pouch with a few meager coins. Her simple wooden cottage, her small plot of land, and all her few possessions were confiscated by the Lord, reverting to the community. Her neighbors, who had once known her as a wife and then a widow, now averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge her plight. There was no farewell, no comfort, only the chilling silence of abandonment. Lyra was escorted to the village limits by two grim-faced guards. As she reached the ancient oak tree that marked the boundary, one of the guards pointed down the winding, muddy track that led away from the only home she had ever known. "Do not return," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you are found within these lands again, you will be considered an outlaw and your life forfeit." The path ahead was desolate and uncertain. For a lone woman in 1240, without family, protection, or resources, the outside world was fraught with peril. There were wild animals, hostile strangers, disease, and the constant threat of starvation. Travel was dangerous, shelter scarce, and charity often begrudged. Lyra, once self-sufficient within her community, was now utterly vulnerable, her life reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. She walked for days, her feet aching, her meager provisions dwindling. She slept beneath hedges, huddled against the cold, and ate whatever meager roots or berries she could identify. Only companions were the gnawing fear in her stomach and the crushing weight of her isolation. She tried to seek refuge in other villages, but word of her banishment often preceded her, or her disheveled appearance and lack of connections made her an unwelcome sight. Many communities were wary of outsiders, especially women who arrived alone, suspecting them of being vagrants, thieves, or worse. Lyra's banishment was not just a physical removal, it was a complete severance of her identity. She had no name, no history, no place in the world. She was simply a disobedient woman, cast out. Her disobedience, born of desperation and defiance, had led her to a fate worse than many physical punishments. While a flogging might heal and a period in the stocks would end, banishment was a life sentence of perpetual struggle, vulnerability, and loneliness. It was a chilling reminder in 1240 that a woman's place in society was conditional, and that a persistent defiance of communal rules, even those born of hardship, could lead to a complete and devastating expulsion from the very fabric of human existence. Lyra, stripped of her past and her future, became a shadow on the winding roads, a ghost of her former self, a stark testament to the ultimate consequence of disrupting the fragile order of medieval life. Number 1. The hanging or burning for sorcery or capital offenses. In 1240, the ultimate punishment for women who committed the gravest acts of disobedience was death. While the full-blown witch hunts of later centuries were still far off, accusations of sorcery, heresy, or other capital offenses certainly existed, and women, often seen as more susceptible to temptation or less rational than men, were frequently targeted. These accusations, though perhaps rare for simple disobedience in isolation, could arise if a woman's defiance of social norms, particularly those linked to religious or moral purity, became extreme or was perceived as a direct challenge to God's order or the Lord's authority. Adultery, if combined with other perceived moral failings, or if it involved a powerful victim, could also escalate to such severe retribution, as could serious forms of theft or blasphemy, often framed as a challenge to divine or temporal law. Consider the terrifying fate of Morwen. She was a village healer, a woman who knew the properties of herbs and roots, skilled at brewing poultices for fevers and salves for wounds. For years, her remedies were sought after, and her wisdom respected. However, Morwenna was also fiercely independent, unafraid to speak her mind, and she had a reputation for possessing knowledge that seemed to transcend the ordinary. She had often challenged the local priest's interpretations of scripture, subtly questioning his authority, and had once publicly refused a direct order from the Lord's bailiff, claiming her herbs were more effective than the Lord's physician. Her disobedience was a simmering rebellion, a refusal to submit to established religious and temporal authority, a defiance that, when combined with her unusual knowledge, made her a dangerous figure. When a sudden plague swept through the village, claiming many lives despite the priest's prayers and the Lord's physician's efforts, fear gripped the community. In their desperation and grief, people looked for a scapegoat. The priest, angered by Morwenna's past challenges to his authority, and the Lord's bailiff, remembering her defiance, subtly fanned the flames of suspicion. Morwenna's unconventional knowledge and independent spirit were twisted into something sinister. Whispers began to circulate. She heals some but allows others to die. She speaks to spirits, not to God. Her knowledge comes from dark places. The accusations against her escalated from disobedience to the far more terrifying charge of sorcery, and even consorting with evil forces, the ultimate act of defiance against God and human order. Morwenna was seized and subjected to a hasty trial, more a formality than a search for truth. Evidence was circumstantial, based on fear and superstition rather than concrete facts. Her defiance in previous encounters, her willingness to question authority, was reinterpreted as evidence of her unholy nature. Her refusal to confess, her insistence on her innocence, was taken as further proof of her wicked stubbornness. Judgment was swift and brutal, guilty of maleficium, of using dark magic to harm the community. The sentence was death by burning, a punishment often reserved for heresy and witchcraft, believed to purify the soul through fire and prevent the evil from spreading. The day of the execution was a grim spectacle, even more terrifying than any public flogging or ducking. A pyre was erected in the central square, stacks of wood piled high, ready for the gruesome display. The air was thick with the scent of fear and the raw wood. Morwenna was led to the stake, her hands bound, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a lingering, desperate defiance. The priest led a prayer, his words condemning her soul to eternal damnation, further cementing her guilt in the minds of the horrified onlookers. The torch was applied to the base of the pyre. Flames licked at the dry wood, crackling and growing, sending plumes of thick, acrid smoke into the cold air. The heat intensified rapidly, quickly becoming unbearable. Morwenna cried out, a raw, primal sound swallowed by the roar of the fire and the murmuring of the crowd. The smoke filled her lungs, choking her, and the flames began to consume her. Her defiance, her independent spirit, and her refusal to conform had led her to this ultimate, agonizing end. It was a terrifying spectacle designed not just to punish Morwenna, but to instill absolute terror and ensure complete obedience in every woman witnessing. In other instances, a woman might be hanged for capital theft, grand larceny, repeated serious offenses, or even certain acts of treason or murder. Gallows, like the pyre, were public symbols of ultimate authority. For a woman, any disobedience that escalated to these levels was a direct challenge to the very structure of medieval society, whether it be religious law, temporal authority, or the sanctity of life itself. Ultimate punishment, death, served as the starkest reminder in 1240 that any fundamental defiance of the established order, particularly when coupled with perceived moral failings or extraordinary circumstances, would be met with an uncompromising and absolute retribution, ensuring that a woman's final act of disobedience would be her last breath. Morwenna's story, though a grim one, highlighted the extreme measures medieval society would take to enforce conformity and suppress any challenge to its rigid power structures, especially from women.